Well, I like introducing people to new things in terms of history and antiques, and historical artifacts on my channel. So hopefully this is new to you. It's kind of cool. If it is, you won't fail to remember after this axe gods. Pretty cool name, right? These are jade axe gods from Costa Rica. We're going to look at a few, and this is a real typical one right here. You get this axe blade-like lower half and a human/bird type face. Costa Rica was very rich in jade, so it's no surprise that the native population seized on it for art. Of course, it wasn't just them. So you can find Aztec jade art, that kind of thing. But this particular tradition is really interesting and fairly unique. It lasted from roughly 500 BC to 900 AD. Now let's take a look at some contemporary Costa Rican zoomorphic, blending human and animal characteristics and appearances in masks. And it's interesting because this is part of the tradition that these pendants played off of as well. These are contemporary, but kind of throwbacks, if you will. So you look over on the left, you see one in green, which is just kind of interesting synchronicity there, and the same here on the left again. And over on the right as well, if you'll notice. Now, does the green, is that supposed to have some kind of connection to traditional jade figures, from their ancestors, or is it just the color they went with? That I don't know, but either way, thought it was a good place to start. On that note, let's look at Costa Rica itself. Looks absolutely gorgeous. I've never been there. This then is where the indigenous population was from that mined the jade. It's also, we say jade as shorthand, but it doesn't have to technically be jade, all of the pendants that you find like this. That was, however, the main material and the most sought, as you can imagine. These are also known as avian pendants because of the bird-like face. In Spanish, this is a dios hacha, god axe, or the way we would say it, axe god. Giving you an idea of the size here and letting you see all of it. That's a beautiful piece of work. This was a big deal to make something like this because jade is not easy to work with. It's a very tough stone. And then stop and realize that you're making this with no metal tools, right? So how do you do that? Well, you have to find minerals that are even harder and then use them to cut into the jade. So they would make abrasive powders, basically. Then you'd have to use that material to grind, drill, carve. One technique would be to coat a string with it and just saw, right, back and forth, saw lines into it. And there's no doubt that must have been very labor-intensive. And if you're going to wear this around your neck, then you needed to have a hole that goes all the way through so you can run a string. And you could see where that was done left to right here, so you had to go across the entire width. Let's break away from this one here that I got to see. Notice the beak there. Here's a much more difficult way to make a bird-like creature with a beak. And that is just a masterwork, obviously. Only the rich and powerful would have owned these, so you could imagine who would have carried this one here. Costa Rica is very rich in bird species. There's a lot, so it's no surprise that they were so influential visually. But it wasn't just the avian or avian/human god, spirit, representation, what have you. Here's an example of something different, or is it? It's hard to tell when you get up to the head. I don't know what kind of animal this is going for, but it looks cool. Meanwhile, here's what we think of as more of a typical Mesoamerican work, right? But it happens to be in this stone. That must have taken a really long time to make. Speaking of that, I'm sure this guy did it too. A very striking mask. I'd never seen anything like it before I researched this subject, and maybe you haven't either. I'm definitely forever fascinated by indigenous masks, especially from Central, South America, and Africa. This one is particularly great. Here's a kind of a lower res image, but I'll show just one more until we get to one that includes an actual human corpse. Well, it's not even a mask, because you can't put this on. This is a decorated skull. And anyway, you can see how precious stones were affixed to it to make that. So, now let's look at a second example that I actually got to see in person, and that's this one here. It has much more of a human-looking face. We are totally guessing, right, when it comes to the iconography and what they were going for, but it definitely looks more human than the last one. Speaking of humans, pendants like this were found on the remains of men, women, and children. They weren't then just worn by shamans or anything like that. When it comes to the axe shape, all we can do again is guess, but the idea that's been posited is that there is a link between these and wood-clearing tools, agricultural tools, some type of synthesis of that and the human/animal god-like form. Who knows? This one here doesn't look very much like that at all, does it, in terms of the axe-like aspect? It looks more like legs, but the Celt or axe blade is much more typical. Well, here's one final one that I got to see in person. A much darker stone, obviously. Like the other two, somewhere around 1500 years old. This tradition died out in the late first millennium. Thanks as always. Hope you found it interesting.